So as we learn about the mechanisms of leadership, turning ourselves into leaders of us, of an individual, of a group, we're going to reach very far. We're going to learn from masters. You are going to learn some theory. You are going to learn some history of leadership. You're going to learn some of the big leadership ideas. One of the things we're going to turn to for inspiration and as a model is what most people agree is one of the greatest leaders in history, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What we're going to do right now is we're going to listen to his most famous speech, what is often thought of as the best speech, maybe in history, #1 speech, which is his "I Have a Dream" speech. It's about 16 minutes long. If you'd like to take notes, feel free. But please stay right here. Just listen to the whole thing all the way through and see what you notice. See what you notice. We ready?
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Fivescore years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with objects. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. And every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
There's something that's apparent, to me anyway, as I've been listening to that speech over and over. I've been listening to it a lot lately. It's clear to me that he lived in a different reality from everyone else that he was interacting with. He could clearly see the new reality that was emerging. He was already there. It wasn't, maybe this is going to happen, or I'd like to help this happen. He was already there. And the words that he was saying, the metaphors that he was choosing, the way that he organized that communication with skill and precision was designed to help other people get to where he was. Does that make sense? It was designed to help them get where they wanted to go anyway. See a vision bigger than they could see for themselves. You can get that speech for free online, along with other great speeches. I recommend that you go and download it and listen to it on a regular basis. You'll get a lot from it if you listen to that one over and over. There's more depth, more subtlety, more power available every time you listen to it. We will review it a few times during this program, and we'll delve into some of the finer points. So the question is leadership. What is it? What is it anyway? What is leadership? One of the challenges with trying to define leadership is that leadership is kind of like life. Asking what is leadership is a lot like asking what is life. Life seems to be, from one perspective, combination of roles, a combination of jobs, tasks, challenges that we need to overcome. I like to think of it kind of in a level that is the right chunk size as a series of roles, a combination of roles. Roles that we have to sometimes use together, sometimes use in sequence. It's very different to be a child than it is to be a parent. And yet, many of us have both of those roles. It's different to be a teacher than it is to be a student, and yet they're related in some way. It's different to be a mentor than it is to be someone that's being mentored. And yet all of these are roles that we play in life. Leadership is similar. With leadership, we have various roles that we need to play. Some of the roles that we're going to talk about in this program are the role of visionary. We're going to talk about what that means, why it already introduced you to the concept of being a visionary and how important that is. Another role that's very critical to being a leader, from my perspective, is the role of being an aligner, someone that aligns people, visions, emotions, outcomes. A critical role that you're going to learn about in this program is the role of being a conflict resolver. If you talk to great leaders, one of the things that you hear them say is, as I evolved as a leader, I learned that it really becomes about conflict resolution. I spent some time with a friend that I've had for several years this past weekend, and this is someone that has grown his business and is now on track to maybe do $100 million in sales this year. I've watched him go from, very small business all the way to this level. And we were kind of joking around about, what it takes to lead a business. And he said, it's amazing. I spend most of my day fixing problems and ironing out conflicts. And I said, exactly. Conflict resolver. Another interesting aspect of leadership, and something that we're really going to spend a lot of time with here, is becoming a creator. A creator. Most people don't know what creator is, what creation even means. But being a leader requires you creating things that have never existed before, creating new things, which requires a lot of energy, a lot of discipline, a lot of confidence. Another role that you're going to learn about is the role of motivator. Motivation is about emotion. Another aspect, and you'll hear me use these interchangeably because they're two sides of the same coin, is inspirer or inspiration. And the way I think of the distinction between motivation and inspiration is motivation is usually externally applied, and it's triggering emotions, kind of a little bit of the stick effect, trying to motivate someone to do something. Inspiration is bringing out the inspired emotions that drive toward accomplishing something greater, for the greater good, something positive. Has a little bit more of a positive kind of connotation, but we'll use the term motivator because that's what we need to do as leaders. We need to help people get in touch with their motivating emotions that they don't know how to get in touch with. Another role of leader is conscious role model. Conscious role model. And when I say conscious role model, what I mean is we wake up to the reality that we're always a role model, whether we want to be or not. Ask any parent how well do as I say, not as I do works. And they'll tell you, not so well. When we become leaders, we turn on the conscious side of ourselves and we realize, oh, everything that I do is role model. And as my friend Steve Krause used to say, people learn who we are by what they catch us doing. I think people learn who we are by what they catch us doing. We become conscious role models. Taking a leadership position forces us to become a better person, become all that we can be. Another role that you'll learn about of a leader is the role of facilitator. Facilitator. I did a live training program last year with about 330 people in it, and we were discussing facilitation, or I was discussing facilitation, and I saw this blank look kind of come over a bunch of people's faces, and I said, who knows what I mean when I say the word facilitation? Just kind of checking in. And of the 330 people, maybe like 5 people raised their hand. I said, okay, this maybe is a little bit more of a mystery than we thought. And the idea of facilitation is not doing it for someone, but helping them do it, providing a space that you can hold for them and a process, a little bit of a container and some resources, helping them get in touch with their own resources so that they do their own growth. They accomplish their own results. And when they're done, they say, I did it. That's facilitation. It requires another level of abstract thinking and awareness. Leader's role is to facilitate. And then finally, let's talk about the role of the leader that is probably the scariest, probably the one that's hardest to wrap your mind around, and also the one that's the hardest to get yourself to do. And as we listen to Dr. Martin Luther King talking about his dream, we got a taste of it. And it's the role of being the bringer from the known to the unknown. Bringing people from what they know to what they don't know. And as you probably know, the fear of the unknown is one of the biggest fears that people have. We get inside of our comfort zones, and we want to stay there. Our emotional thermostat wants to keep us in our comfort zone more than anything else. And so an important role that you're going to learn as a leader is how to bring people from the known, from what they know, into the unknown. Now, in order to learn these different roles and then to integrate them together, we must learn what they mean, how they work. Each one is a different model. Each one has different mindsets, different practices, different approaches, different challenges that you must deal with. Sometimes you run into a problem with one and it's not working and you've got to take another one. Sometimes you have to combine them together. This is one of the reasons why leadership is not so simple. It's not something you just learn a couple of techniques and then boom, you're a leader. It requires a multi-dimensional awareness. As I mentioned before, dealing with conflict is a huge part of leadership. Another piece that you're going to learn is that the leader's job, in a lot of ways, is to stand in ambiguity, confusion, uncertainty, chaos, and to be completely okay, so that everyone else can look at them and say, okay, if they're not freaked out, then everything's probably going to be all right. So that they can keep it together while they're trying to figure out what to do. So that they can lean on your security as a leader, they can calm their amygdala and their fear centers down. They can look at the leader and say, okay, everything's going to be all right. Now I can get back to being effective as an individual, as a contributor. There are a lot of quotes around this particular idea, around being able to stand in the face of conflicting evidence, conflicting information, to not take sides, to tolerate ambiguity, to thrive on chaos, these types of things. And that's something that really defines great leaders. One of the things that Wyatt said to me several months ago that was like one of those giant beacons of truth was, all decisions are made with too little information. Okay, so think about that for a second. All decisions are made with too little information. You know, Wyatt, you can just go home. I'm just going to quote all your stuff for the rest of the thing. You don't need to be here for this. So all decisions are made with too little information. How do we know? Because if you had enough information, no decision would be necessary. It would be obvious what to do. You wouldn't even have to decide. Right? So all decisions are made with too little information. All humans, okay, now I'm generalizing, but all humans, essentially all the time, are in nervousness, anxiety, insecurity, because they're being faced with more and more decisions that they have to make, more and more communication coming in all the time, more and more confusion, and they have too little information. And they're being pushed to make decisions, and more rides on it, and you see, and it's all becoming more interdependent. There's more fear, like what if I make the wrong decision? Is that going to screw up the rest of my life and everyone else's life? So if you want to become a leader, you have to first mentally accept that part of your job is to stand in the middle of too little information, too much confusion, too much chaos, and rest there. What's it like right in the middle, right in the eye of the hurricane? It's calm. And that's where you need to be. And know that it's calm in the center. It's calm right in the middle of the hurricane. Everyone else, right, they're too scattered to go look for the center and to be calm and figure out what to do. They're running around in the hurricane and they're being blown. So as the leader, one of your most important jobs is to stand in the eye of the storm and be okay and be a beacon of security for everyone else. Now, as it turns out, there are some obstacles. There are a few key obstacles that Wyatt and I have identified that we're going to talk to you about that prevent leadership success. And just like it's important to focus on the goal and figure out how to get there, it's also important to notice when there are obstacles in the way and move them out of the way. I can pretty much guarantee you that the first person to drive an automobile from the east coast of the United States to the west coast of the United States did not just go driving out into the wilderness at 70 miles an hour and make the journey. The first train to come across didn't go without tracks. It first required a group of organized, intelligent human beings to go plot the path, remove all the obstacles, pave the way. You follow? So we need to look at some of the obstacles. We need to face them head on. We need to become aware of them. And then we need to overcome some of them. So we're going to identify a few of the obstacles, especially the inner obstacles right now, so that we can just see what the path looks like, see some of the issues that we need to deal with as we go. So one of the obstacles is our physiology, especially our brain physiology, how we're wired. Now, a guy named Dr. Paul MacLean, several decades ago, came up with a theory that he called the triune brain theory. Now, not everyone buys into this, but it's been a model of the brain that's worked really well for me and has served me very well over the years. So I'm going to share it with you. Now remember, you'll hear me say this a few times, but don't believe any of this stuff too much. Okay, don't buy into anything 100%. Try it out if it works for you. If it's a good model, great. If not, throw it out. Okay, I'm not attached to any of these things. But try this one on because I think it'll work very well. The idea behind the triune brain is that we essentially have three brains in one. Triune, that we have an old brain, a reptilian brain, that we kind of have a middle brain, the mammalian or emotional brain, and then we have a new brain, which is the cortex or the logical brain. If you ever seen pictures of embryos of different animals that are, whatever, a couple of weeks old, and you'll see that there's a turtle and a shrimp and a human, and they all look the same. Okay, because we go through these levels of evolution, and our previous evolution is stored in our development, interestingly enough. Well, our brains evolved on top of each other, and they're built essentially like a house, where there's a foundation, and then we do some framing, and then we put a roof on top of it. And the older mechanisms in the brain were used as the foundation for the newer mechanisms. Carl Jung, one of the almost the mythological stories about him is that he had a dream one time, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but he had a dream that caused a lot of insight for him, where he dreamed that he was in a house, and he was walking around in the house, and there was a door to go down to the cellar. And so he opened the door, and he walked down to the cellar, and he was looking around the cellar. It was dark there. And then he realized that there was another hatch that went down into another room below. And so he, I think he lit a torch, and he opened up this hatch, and he went down this stairway, like ladder down, and it was a much older, darker, more damp and ancient place in the house. And as he was looking around there, he realized that there was another little door in the corner that was like a trap door. And he moved the dust away, and he opened it up, and he had to lower himself into it, and it was just an old dirt room that was filled with dirt and bones. And he was in there looking at it, and then when he woke up, he realized that this was a metaphor for his own consciousness, and that there were these much older places inside of his brain and his mind that he had to come to terms with. So the triune brain theory essentially says that at the top of our spinal cord, right at the kind of the base of our skull here, that we've got this lump of cells that's the reptilian brain. And this is the physical brain. This is the one that, just like a snake or a lizard, is walking around, and anytime it sees something move, it's like, should I eat that thing? Should I fight it, or should I mate with it? That's it. And I was in the, I was very fortunate. I went to the Galapagos Islands a couple of weeks ago, and as you're walking around, you get to see all the wildlife and watch them interact with each other, and they're not afraid of you as a person. So it's like being in the middle of a nature documentary, and you get to watch the animals do their thing. And we went into a kind of a reserve area, and they had two of these large iguanas. And it's kind of ironic that we're in the Galapagos Islands, and now I'm talking about a part where the animals were in cages, but that's for another conversation at a different time. They had these two iguanas, and they were two male iguanas, and they had to be separated so they wouldn't fight. And they had this screen next to them. And the two of them had this huge area, a big area that was their own area, that they could walk around. But no, the two of them wanted to be next to the screen, looking at each other and doing their little, and sizing each other up and like doing their whole thing. Okay? Even though they couldn't get at each other. That's the lizard brain inside of us. What evolved on top of that is the mammalian brain. My mentor Jerry used to call it the golden retriever, or the tail wagging brain. You know, when a dog comes running into the room and he's happy and he's like jumping up on you, he'll still stick his nose right into your crotch and give you a good sniff because he's got the lizard brain in there too. But it's the part of our brain that is concerned with love and affection and acceptance. It's the emotional brain. And what grew on top of that is the big cortex and kind of this whole logical brain. Now, what separates us from other animals is this reflexive logical brain that symbolizes and uses language, et cetera, et cetera. So what does all this mean, and why does it matter to leadership? Well, my experience is that most people live in their older brains. Okay, their older brains use the newer brains for their own ends. Okay, so most people have a physical reptilian brain that uses the emotional brain and the logical brain to get food, sex, and social status. And then it uses the logical brain to rationalize the whole thing so that it sounds logical. And there's a great explanation for it, and I'm right, and I'm good, and I'm not bad. Now, what leaders seem to have figured out how to do is get the logical, the thinking part of the brain to steer the ship. get the higher self to steer the ship. Now, I've known some highly intelligent, very abstract thinking, very logical people that thought that they were totally in control of their emotions and their body, and they were completely deluded. It was still those older brains just using this really high IQ to accomplish its own goals. There's been a lot of talk in the last couple of decades about intuition and trusting your intuition and trusting your emotions, and people do things and they go, oh yeah, boy, you know, if I would have just listened to my intuition, I wouldn't have done that thing. Who's ever had that feeling like, oh, I knew I shouldn't have done that thing? Well, what were you listening to if you weren't listening to your intuition? You were listening to your other intuition. I mean, you did the other thing. Right? It's kind of an insane thing to say, I didn't listen to my intuition. Because you did. You just listened to the wrong one. You listened to the evil one. Right? We all got the little angel and the devil on our shoulders. Metaphorically speaking, of course. So one of the challenges of leadership is aligning these three brains, taking control of them and directing them rather than them directing you. Now, I'm going to get a little woo-woo on you here. Everybody ready to get a little woo-woo? Okay, good. Oh yeah, woo-woo. All right. That could be the call for this program. Woo-woo. On an intuitive level, I think we all know that at least some part of us has the power to captain the ship. Who knows, just knows at the deepest level that they have some part of them that can captain this ship. It's just a matter of how. Got to figure out how to get it to captain the ship. Now, who is also sometimes gets frustrated as hell because that part is not on the bridge? Right? Good. Well, one of the obstacles is these three brains. And here's the important part. Here's the thing that you need to know. Each of the brains is an incredibly powerful unit or system on its own. The physical brain, the ancient reptilian brain, the emotional brain, the mammalian brain, and the logical or thinking brain, they operate really well as a system. But they don't communicate with each other very well. The connections between them are not very strong. And you'll notice in life that many or most of the conflicts that you face are a conflict between these three brains. That usually when your emotional intuition told you not to do something, but you did it anyway, it was because your physical intuition told you to do it. Or you look at the logical scenario and you say, logically, this is a bad idea, but you do it anyway? Well, it was probably because your emotional intuition was telling you to do it. You actually have three different intuitions. They don't speak the same language. One speaks English, one speaks mathematics, and the other one speaks Klingon. You've got to get them to play nice together. So just having the awareness of this, right? Stephen Covey said, awareness builds its own momentum. Just having the awareness of this help you realize that when you're dealing with inner conflict, it's often coming because the brains aren't aligned, and you got to get them in the same place. And you got to say, okay, logically, where am I coming from? Emotionally, where am I coming from? Physically, where am I coming from? Get on the bridge, steer the ship. I was talking to someone recently about Buckminster Fuller. Bucky Fuller was this really brilliant member of our species that was around for a while. And one of his favorite thing to do was what he called trim tabbing. And does anyone know what trim tabbing is? Okay, a few people. Was it you that I was talking to this about? No? Okay, good. So a giant ship has a rudder that turns the ship. Now, if you connect the wheel of the ship to the rudder, especially if it's a big ship, there's no way that a person can turn that huge rudder and turn it the force against the ocean that's coming at it, or the river that's coming at it. But what they'll put is like a little miniature rudder on the front of the rudder, and if you turn that, then it turns the whole rudder, in the same way that the whole rudder turns the ship. So with this little bit of leverage on the trim tab, you can turn the whole rudder. And by just stopping when you feel conflict, or you sense conflict in others, and saying, okay, where are the three brains at? You can often trim tab and align them, because you're aware of where the conflict is coming from. And you've got a model to use with which to operate. You see, in life, if you don't have a model, and we're going to dig more into this during the program, but if you don't have a model in your head of how something works, then it's very difficult to go to work on it. If I dropped you in the middle of San Francisco, and you didn't know San Francisco, and I said, get from point A to point B, and you had no map, and you couldn't talk to anyone, it'd be really difficult for you to you wouldn't even know where to start and where to go. On the other hand, a simple map of the city, boom, you've got a model. So this is a model of the brains and how they work. And it's a model that can really help you substantially make progress toward becoming a leader, because it helps you manage some of the conflict. Obstacle number 2 that you're going to face often is what I'm going to call hardwired personality. Hardwired personality. Now, we're painting with some broad strokes here, and there's obviously a lot that we need to leave out because life is very complex. We're just hitting the leverage points. We're trying to trim tab ourselves. Just like we get the hardwired brains, my experience is that we get hardwired personality. And the neuroscientists are starting to find DNA-level connections to hardwired personality. When I started reading about personality and learning about it 10, 12, 15 years ago, I had an intuitive sense that after interacting with people and seeing them and looking at their children and so forth, that this was going to come true. And it's amazing to see it actually coming into reality, that they're finding genetic connections to personality. Now, there are many personality models, and typologies are beyond the scope of this particular training. But if you study things like the Enneagram or Carl Jung's theories that have been translated into the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator, or Kathy Kolbe's work around conation, study any of these, you'll find that there seem to be different personality types that, for better or worse, seem to just, you get them at birth. It's kind of your lot in life. Now, these can be an obstacle to leadership because, number one, you're dealing with yourself and whatever personality that you have. And there's a concept called the Pygmalion Project, which is that we all try to turn everybody else into who we are, and we project our personality, our values, our little screen onto everyone else, and if they don't meet us, then we try to turn them into us. And I've been very guilty of this myself, and I continue to be every day with people that I love and people that I work with. But there's also the other person and their personality, and they're doing the same thing with you. And just to kind of give you a little indication of how complex this is, some people like to look at the big picture, and they zoom out and they go to 100,000 feet and they want to look at the forest. And that's how they're wired. Some people like to look at the bark on one tree, and you're saying, come over here and look at the forest. And they're like, but that doesn't look like what I'm seeing. Some people love to keep all their options open and wait till the very last minute to come to a decision. And even when they come to a decision, it's not really a decision. It's just kind of what we're going to do for now until things change, because they're going to. And some people like to make decisions as soon as possible and then put them behind them and then make another decision and create structure around the world and so forth. These two types drive each other nuts. Who's driven nuts by the other type? Raise your hand. Okay. Bruce says, my wife. Exactly. And oftentimes, you'll choose as a mate the other type. Right? Why? Because when you meet them, you're like, wow, you're so different and interesting, and you know all this great stuff. And then the day after you get married, you're like, you are crazy. How come I never noticed? But you pull each other toward integration and you learn from each other. And if you can see these as strengths and you can see the strength of the other person rather than taking out all your childhood issues on them, you might actually be able to make some progress and grow as a human being, which I've just been learning how to do in the last few years myself. Changing people is hard business. It's really, really hard business. It is possible, but it's kind of possible in the sense that, like, going into outer space is possible. And you might go, but I don't know, it's kind of hard work, right? A lot of effort to change another person. When you're dealing with a difference and you can just see, wow, I don't see the world the same way as this other person, chalk 80% of it up, in most cases, to they're just a different human being. They've got a different screen. They've got a different set of lenses that they look through, and you're not going to change them into you. Best strategy, anyone know? Seek to understand their model of the world. You might call it empathy, compassion. In business, I've called it see through their eyes. See if you can get a model in your mind of how they're working. So accept. Accept. Very important to accept. And then the last thing that I want to talk to you about before Wyatt shares a few obstacles is someone has a drastically inaccurate model of reality. Now, this is where things start getting subjective, because essentially every great leader who ever helped our species go to the next level had a bad model of reality. Right? They had a very deviant, weird model of reality. So we have to draw a distinction between someone that has a inaccurate or bad model of reality, but theirs is the next level, and a bad or inaccurate model of reality, and it's because they're kind of at the pre-level. They haven't gotten to the conventional level. Ken Wilber has a version of this, and it's one of his great innovations, and he calls it the pre-trans fallacy. The pre-trans fallacy. And the pre-trans fallacy is essentially that whatever the quote-unquote conventional way of looking at the world is, or the conventional level, wherever that level is at, and it can be in religion, it can be in business, it can be a values system, wherever culture, fashion, wherever everyone is at, the 80% of the group, they're going to look at people that are that haven't gotten, quote unquote, up to that level or haven't evolved to that level, and they're going to look at people that are trans who have gone past that level and now have that level plus many other levels. The conventional level is going to look at both of them and say, you guys are exactly the same. You're both wrong. You're both bad, and you're both the same kind of bad. It's the pre-trans fallacy. So when they interviewed conscientious objectors to the Vietnam War, what they found was that most of the conscientious objectors who said, I can't do this because my conscience, my religion, whatever, doesn't allow me to do it. I don't feel good about being at war and hunting other human beings, killing other human beings. When they really dug in and they interviewed them, most of them actually were not conscientious objectors. Most of them were lying. But there was a little minority that after they got into it and they interviewed them, they figured out that they had done all of the internal, intellectual, moral kind of development, and they really were conscientious objectors. Now, to people at the conventional level, which were like, we should go to war, they looked at both of those and they didn't matter, because they were all cowards, unpatriotic, whatever, both bad. They couldn't draw a distinction between the two. Our models of reality, what we think, is usually affected by whatever the conventional level is, what everyone else thinks. And this model that we have in our head is limiting or quote-unquote bad to degree that it limits us to get to the next level. And so here's the leverage point. Here's the trim tab for this idea. There's always a next level. Always a next level. Every person, every situation, everything evolves in some direction. The idea of a static reality, that's an idea. It's not the way things really are. We look around, and because we have minds that like to freeze things and stay in comfort zones, we imagine that things are static. We imagine that they're event-driven. It's also a very kind of Western idea. But if you could zoom in to the subatomic level, or you could zoom way out to the universe level, and just look at that for a couple of moments, you'd realize everything's moving and dynamic, and there's no way to freeze it. When you freeze your model, that's when you start running into challenges. And that's a big problem getting to leadership, because leaders know that everything's dynamic, everything's changing all the time. There's nothing that you can do about that. And that most people are going to want to feel like they're living in a bubble of security. And so part of the leader's very challenging role is to show that change and evolution is the safest place to be. In other words, to teach people how to live in change and live in evolution, live in a dynamic world, and that's the safest, most secure place to live. As we were listening to Martin Luther King talk about his dream, I mean, you got to imagine back in, was it 1963, that was a pretty wild bunch of stuff to be talking about at that point. And yet, the metaphors and the images and the whole thing that he was talking about, somehow when you're left at the end, keeping things the same way isn't acceptable. It's not going to work. It's not a safe place to be anymore. But changing and evolving into this new place is. You follow? Okay. So, models of reality, inaccurate models of reality, static models of reality, these are huge obstacles to leadership. And there's something that we have to overcome in ourselves and help others overcome as well.